Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to programmatically create and delete posts right from within our PHP code. Without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Alright, so I'm on a Professor Detail screen, and I have not liked this professor yet. So if I click on this like box, and then check my console, we can see that our JavaScript sends a request to our custom endpoint. And at the moment, that custom endpoint doesn't actually do anything. It just responds back with this little bit of text. So our goal for this lesson is to write a bit of PHP that actually does create a new like post. So let's get started with that right now. Jump over to your text editor, and within your theme folder, let's look inside the INC subfolder and open up like-route. Towards the bottom of this file, we see our create like and delete like functions. Let's go ahead and begin with the create like. Let's delete this sample test message return line. And instead, I want to introduce you to a WordPress function named WP insert post. This WordPress function will let us programmatically create a new post right from within our PHP code. So check this out. Within its parentheses, we just provide an array. Okay, and then within this array, we just describe a new post that we want to create. So within the array parentheses, I will drop down just to stay organized, and then just start describing a post. So I could say post type equals like. Obviously, you could set this to whatever you want. Post, page, professor, campus, note. In our case, we want to create a like at this moment. Okay, then let's include a comma. We can provide another property. Let's say post status. And this defaults to a value of draft, but we don't want that. So we want to specify that the status should be publish. So that way WordPress considers it a complete finalized post. Okay, let's create a new line. Let's target post title. You don't actually need to include a title. WordPress will let you create a post without a title, but just for fun, why don't we say our PHP create post test. Okay, and then let's include one more property. Let's say post content, and just for fun, let's say hello world 123. Okay, now let's go ahead and save this and then test it out on the front end. So now if I go ahead and click the like box and check my console, we no longer see that thanks for trying to create a post because we deleted that return message. So at the moment, our endpoint function is not returning anything. That's why we see null here. We can fix this in just a moment so that our function does indeed return a response of some sort. But for now, let's jump over to the admin dashboard. And in the sidebar, let's click on likes. And perfect. There we can see our brand new post that we created from within our PHP code. So if we click on it, obviously its post type is a like. Here's the title we entered. We can see the status is published. And you might be wondering where the main content field is. Well, you might remember that when we first registered the like post type, we said that it doesn't need the main editor field. So this has nothing to do with the task at hand, but if you really want to prove to yourself that our content text of hello world 123 made it through, you can jump over into your text editor, and instead of our theme folder, jump into our MU plugins folder, and within the file where we registered the like post type, within the supports array, after title, just include editor. So if I save that, and then jump back into the edit screen for the like post. Cool, here's the main body content, and you can see our text that we entered. We don't actually need that field, so I'm gonna get rid of editor once again. I just wanted to prove to you that our post content line successfully made it through. Okay, and now that we've learned the basics of creating a post from within our PHP, let's move on to something a tiny bit trickier. Next, we need to learn how to assign a value to this custom field, right? This should contain the ID number of the professor that you want to like. So let's jump back into our PHP and learn how to assign a value to a custom field. First, why don't we go ahead and get rid of the post content line? We don't actually need that. Okay, and for this next test, why don't we change the title to second PHP test? Again, the title doesn't matter. This is just for fun and so we can differentiate the different posts within the admin. Okay, but to get back to the task at hand, on a new line, so comma, new line, let's add a new property named meta input. And we want to set this to an array. And you know me, within the parentheses for an array, I like to drop down. And now we can create as many key value pairs as we want. So we could say sky color equals blue and grass color equals green. And this will create WordPress native custom fields. Or sometimes WordPress officially refers to them as meta fields. So this is the meta key, the key name, and this is the value. Key name value. But we don't actually want sky color blue and grass color green. Instead, we want liked professor ID, right? Because that's the name of this custom field. And the Advanced Custom Fields plugin is really just an abstraction layer between the WordPress native meta fields and giving us a luxurious, intuitive user interface. So luckily for us, the Advanced Custom Fields plugin matches whatever you used for the custom field name. It also uses that exact name for the key name, meaning we can use this WordPress native way of adding a meta field. And if we use the exact custom field name for our key, well, we can just give it a value of whatever we want. In the future, obviously, we would want this to be a dynamic number that is actually the current professor ID. But for now, just as a test, why don't we set it to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now let's go ahead and save this and test it out on the front end. So if I click the like box once again, and then jump back into my admin dashboard and refresh the all likes page. Cool, there we see our brand new post with the title of second PHP test. And if I click on it, beautiful, we can see that that custom field received the value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now obviously we don't actually want this to be a fake hard-coded number. We want this to be the actual ID number of whatever professor you're viewing when you click on the like box. And the first step towards making that happen is learning how to send along a bit of data within our JavaScript request that we send off to WordPress. Let me show you what I mean. So right now, let's jump into our text editor, and within our JavaScript modules folder, let's jump into our like.js. Let's look for our method that has a name of createLike. Here it is. So we are using the Ajax tool to send off a request to this URL. And now we just want to modify this request that we're sending to send along a bit of data. So it doesn't matter where. You could add a new line above the URL line or below the type line. Doesn't matter where, but we just want a new property named data. And let's send along a JavaScript object. So in JavaScript, in this context, a pair of curly brackets creates an object. Let's be sure to include a comma after this. Okay, and within the object, we can send along as many different properties as we want. So we could say sky colon, so sky equals blue. And then you could have another comma and say grass colon, say that it equals green. Right? The idea is you could send along as many properties as you want, but in our case, we only need to send along one property within this data object. We can name the property whatever we want. Why don't we call it professor ID, and let's say colon, let's set it to equal, and in just a moment, we can learn how to set it to the actual ID number of the current professor. But first, for now, just as a quick test, why don't we set it to 789? Just as a quick test so that we can learn how to receive this data on the server side. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this and make sure that your JavaScript is getting rebundled. And just a quick note before we move on, as far as WordPress is concerned, this way of sending data is the same thing as adding on to the end of the URL and saying $professor ID equals 789. So after WordPress processes and parses the incoming request, this is basically the equivalent of this. So it's up to you of how you want to include data within your request, but I feel like the data property is a bit cleaner, a bit more organized instead of just tacking stuff on to the end of the URL. So let me remove this from the URL. Okay, let's keep this data property in place. And now let's go learn how to access this from within our custom endpoint, right? How can we access this from the server side? So let's jump back into our likeroute.php file. Here's our create like function that we've been working on. And the beauty of the REST API and this register REST route function is that it passes along any incoming data from the request into this callback function. So all we need to do to access that information is within the parentheses of the function definition, just include a parameter, let's say $data. And now within this function, right up at the top of the function, we can access that professor ID number that our JavaScript is sending by just saying $data and then look inside the array, because WordPress smushes together all of the incoming data, whether it's in a JavaScript object or appended to the end of the URL. WordPress smushes all of that together into an array. So if we look inside that array for a property named Professor ID, right? We want this to exactly match whatever we used back in our JavaScript file when we said data and the property name is Professor uppercase I, lowercase d. So back in our PHP, this code right here will allow us to access that value. And just to be extra secure and safeguard ourselves from malicious users, why don't we sanitize this value before we actually use it down here? So up here, I'm going to wrap this within a WordPress function named sanitize text field, parentheses, and then just cut and paste this to live within these parentheses. Okay, and right now this value is just sort of floating in space here. So instead, at the beginning of this line, let's create a variable. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name it professor equals. Okay, so now we've got this variable that equals the incoming professor ID. So down here, when we are creating a brand new post, instead of hard coding this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's just say our professor variable. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and test it out on the front end. Whoops, looks like we've got an error here. I think I know what the problem is. I forgot to include a semicolon at the end of this line. So be sure to include semicolon. Save that again. And actually, you might want to perform a hard refresh just to make sure that your browser has received the updated JavaScript. So you can just hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and click the refresh icon. Okay, and now if we click on the like box and then jump over to the WordPress admin and refresh the all likes page, cool, we see a brand new post. It's using the same title, but that's just because we didn't choose a new title value. That's not important, but if we click on it to view its details, cool, we can see that we successfully retrieved that value from the JavaScript request. Except we don't actually want our JavaScript to hard code the value to 789. Instead, we want our JavaScript to dynamically use the ID number of whatever professor you're currently viewing when you click on the like box. So the first step towards making that happen is, why don't we adjust the HTML that gets generated for the like box? And let's set it up so that it includes a data attribute that equals the ID of the current professor. Okay, and then once we've output that into the HTML, then it's no problem for our JavaScript to access that. So if I want to customize the likebox HTML, we want to jump into a PHP template. So in our theme folder, let's open up single-professor.php. Let's scroll down until we find the likebox span. Here it is. we've already got one data attribute named data exists. So maybe right before that, let's set up another data attribute. It doesn't matter what you name it, but I will call it data-professor. And I'm going to set it to equal, and then within the quotes, let's drop into PHP and just call the WordPress function the ID. Okay, so if I save that, then back on the front end, if I refresh and inspect the like box, perfect, we see that data attribute equals, and yours will be a different number, but in my case, 103 is the ID for Dr. Meowsalot. So now let's just go update our JavaScript to be able to access this value. So back in our text editor within like.js, let's scroll up a little bit and focus on our events area. So when the like box gets clicked on, or any of the sub-elements that live within the like box, that's going to fire off our method named ourClickDispatcher, and then it's going to decide whether it should run delete like or create like. Now remember, in this function we created a variable named currentLikeBox, and we can trust that this will always point towards the overall span parent that has a class of LikeBox. So why don't we do this? Down here, when we run or execute the createLike method, within the parentheses, let's pass it currentLikeBox. And while we're at it, why don't we do the same thing for the deleteLike method? So in these parentheses, currentLikeBox. Okay, so now if we're passing that along to our createLike method, within the function definition parentheses, let's include that as a parameter. currentLikeBox. Okay, so now we've got this easy to use reference that points towards the element with the data attribute. So in our AJAX request for our data property, let's say professor ID should equal, and then instead of 789, we can just say currentLikeBox.data to look for a data attribute, and we gave it an attribute name of data-professor. So since we're using the data method, we don't need to include the data dash. We can just say professor. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And back on the front end, perform a hard refresh. And now if I click the like box, and then jump over to the admin dashboard and refresh the all likes page, here we see a new post. Let's check it out. Perfect. We see a real ID value that matches Dr. Meowsalot. Or if I jump to the Froggerson professor page and click the like box here, and then jump back into the admin, refresh the likes screen, click on the newest post. Perfect. It's got a different ID value that matches Dr. Froggerson. So at this point, we have now successfully used PHP to programmatically create a new post, and we've used JavaScript to send over the relevant, correct professor ID. This is excellent. However, what we have still yet to do is implement our custom logic and restrictions for our API endpoint, right? We want to set things up so that you need to be logged in with a user account in order to create a like. We haven't set that up yet, so at the moment, a random stranger could come here, click the like box, and it would create a like. We don't want that. And we also need to set up the logic so that each user account can only create one like per professor. Because right now, I could go to the front end and click this like box 100 times to create 100 likes for Dr. Froggerson. Okay, now setting up all of that custom logic and those restrictions is exactly what we are going to work on in the next part of this lesson. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.